World War II in the winter of 1945 was a frozen nightmare, but nothing in history prepared anyone for the sheer terror of standing alone in front of 6 Tiger tanks and 600 German infantry. At 0700 on January 24th, 1945, First Lieutenant Garlin Murl Conner crouched in the frozen command post of the 3rd Battalion, 7th Infantry Regiment, staring through binoculars at the tree line 400 yards ahead as German artillery shells tore it apart. 25 years old, recently returned from the hospital with wounds still healing, Conner knew every second counted. The Germans had massed 6 Mark VI Tiger tanks and 600 infantry troops in a counterattack designed to smash through the American positions near Houssen, France, in the Colmar Pocket. Conner was 5 feet 6 inches tall, 120 pounds, a tobacco farmer from Clinton County, Kentucky. He had never finished high school. The nearest school had been 15 miles from his family farm. He enlisted in March 1941. 4 years of war had passed, 10 major campaigns, 4 amphibious assaults, wounded 7 times. His last injury had sent him to the hospital just 3 weeks earlier. The Colmar Pocket was the last German-held territory in France, 850 square miles of frozen forests and farm fields west of the Rhine River. Since November, the Germans had held it, and every attempt to dislodge them had failed. Thousands of French First Army soldiers had died trying to push them back. Operation Nordwind had begun on New Year's Day, 1945, Hitler's last major offensive in the West. Though it had failed elsewhere, the German forces in the Colmar Pocket were desperate and determined. Conner's battalion had held its line for 18 days. Temperatures averaged 10 degrees below zero. Soldiers slept in frozen foxholes when sleep was possible. German patrols probed the American positions every night. 43 men had been lost in the past 2 weeks, mostly to artillery and sniper fire. Conner's role as an intelligence officer was not to fight. He gathered enemy information, interrogated prisoners, and plotted positions on maps. He should have been behind the line. But Conner never stayed behind. 4 Silver Stars proved it. Each award marked an act where he risked his life to save others. October 1943 in Italy, January 1944 at Anzio, September 1944 in France, February 1945. At 07:15, the German artillery barrage intensified. Shells walked across the battalion's forward positions. Trees exploded, dirt and frozen earth fountained into the air. 12 minutes of deafening silence followed by approaching tank engines. A runner burst into the command post. Germans advancing, 6 Tigers, infantry behind them. Hundreds of soldiers moving through the frozen woods toward the battalion's left flank. The battalion commander looked at the map. If the Tigers reached the positions, the foxholes would be overrun. There were no American tanks, no tank destroyers. Only artillery could stop them. But the forward observation post had been destroyed. Observers were dead or wounded. Conner studied the map. 400 yards of open ground separated the command post from the enemy. Someone had to run, observe, and direct the artillery. Without him, the attack would succeed. Without him, the battalion would fall. Conner picked up a telephone and 400 yards of wire. He looked at the battalion commander, then stepped into the snow. The German barrage had stopped but would resume. If you want to see how Conner's choice turned the tide of this desperate battle, hit that like button and subscribe. Every story of a forgotten World War II hero deserves to be remembered. Back to the battle. Conner ran across frozen snow, telephone wire trailing behind him, the handset clutched in his right hand. Shells began landing around him, trees exploded, splinters and shrapnel rained down. He vaulted over a broken tree trunk. Concussions hit his body like hammers. At 250 yards, another tree fell, splitting in half. He barely avoided it. At 300 yards, he reached the American front line. Soldiers stared. An intelligence officer running toward the German advance was carrying a telephone, not stopping to explain. Conner pressed forward. 30 yards beyond the foxholes, he found a shallow ditch maybe 18 inches deep. Not enough to stop bullets, not enough for artillery, but enough to give him a view of the advancing German forces. He cranked the handset. Connection buzzed. A voice. American 105mm howitzers, 12 guns, 3 miles behind the front line. Conner was now the eyes of the 3rd Battalion's artillery. Everything depended on what he could see and whether he could survive long enough to direct the fire. German infantry were 200 yards away, moving through the trees in squads. Rifles ready, advancing in short rushes. Tigers behind them, massive 60-ton monsters moving slowly through the frozen woods, covered by the trees. Conner's position was exposed, alone, 30 yards ahead of the line, directing artillery fire that could save hundreds of American soldiers or get him killed instantly. Every breath of cold winter air, every snowflake landing on his frozen face, every heartbeat counted. Conner raised his head above the ditch rim. The Germans had not seen him yet. He gave the coordinates. Fire mission. The shells would land soon. This was not theory. This was life or death. Conner had become the lifeline between 12 American guns and 600 German soldiers moving to destroy everything he had fought for. The winter morning of January 24th, 1945, was silent except for the occasional whistling of cold wind across the frozen Colmar pocket. First Lieutenant Garlin Murl Conner had already observed German artillery tearing apart the tree line 400 yards ahead. The shells had stopped for the moment, but Conner knew the quiet meant only one thing. The German counterattack would resume, and soon. 6 Tiger tanks, each 60 tons of armored fury, and 600 German infantry were advancing, moving with methodical precision through the snow-covered forest. Conner's battalion, the 3rd Battalion, 7th Infantry Regiment, had no tanks to oppose them. Only the artillery, and only if someone could direct it, could halt the German advance. Conner picked up a telephone and 400 yards of wire. His mind calculated the risk in milliseconds. 100 yards of open ground, 200, 300. Every step could be his last. The cold bit through his uniform. Snow crunched under his boots. He vaulted over a fallen tree trunk, avoiding splinters from shattered branches. Artillery shells fell around him, 40 yards to the left, 30 to the right. Each blast shook the frozen ground and threatened to tear him apart. Yet Conner pressed on, carrying the lifeline that could save hundreds of American soldiers or fail to do so. At 300 yards, Conner reached the front line foxholes. Soldiers stared as an intelligence officer ran past them, clutching a telephone handset. He did not stop to explain. He pushed onward 30 yards beyond the foxholes and dropped into a shallow ditch 18 inches deep. The snow around him was pristine until it was torn apart by the approaching German advance. Conner cranked the handset and heard the faint buzz of connection. 105mm howitzers, 12 guns, 3 miles behind the front line, the voice reported. Conner's hands tightened around the phone. He was now the eyes of the 3rd Battalion's artillery, the only observer between 600 German soldiers and the American line. The German infantry advanced in squads, rifles at the ready, moving through the frozen trees in short, controlled rushes. Behind them, the 6 Tiger tanks pushed forward slowly, using the trees as cover. Conner's heart raced. Each breath of frigid air felt like fire. He gave the first coordinates. Fire mission. The distant American guns responded, sending 12 shells arcing toward the German advance. The first shells landed behind the German formation. Dirt and splinters flew into the air. The infantry faltered slightly, but the Tigers pressed on. Conner adjusted the fire, moving the shells across the advancing formation. Each time the Germans tried to regroup, he called another salvo. Fire for effect. Drop 100 yards. Adjust left. Adjust right. He monitored every movement, every signal from the German squad leaders, every motion of the Tiger turrets. The artillery fell like a storm of iron and fire. Conner was completely exposed. The ditch offered minimal protection. Each shell that landed near him sent frozen dirt and fragments into the air, striking dangerously close. He felt every concussive wave as though his bones had been cracked by a hammer. Yet he continued, issuing orders, calculating trajectories, and predicting German movements with terrifying precision. The infantry began to break apart under the concentrated fire. Soldiers dived into snow-covered craters. Some tried to crawl behind trees. Chaos reigned in the forest, but the Tigers remained a deadly threat. The massive tanks moved in wedge formations, 2 at the front, 2 behind, 2 in the rear. Each turret scanned for targets. The 88mm guns fired, cracking like thunder through the winter morning. Foxholes were obliterated. Dirt, snow, and frozen timber exploded around the defenders. Conner did not hesitate. He shifted fire directly in front of the lead tanks. One Tiger's track was damaged, causing it to swerve and stop. Smoke poured from another. American machine gunners cut down fleeing tank crews. Conner's artillery fire was precise, deadly, and methodical. Even as the Tigers were immobilized, the German infantry regrouped, using the remaining armor as cover. Conner's hands were numb, his uniform soaked with snow and ice. He adjusted coordinates, walking shells across the German positions, keeping the attackers suppressed. Every second was life or death. Every call could mean victory or the annihilation of the Third Battalion. Conner's focus never wavered, despite the cold, the fear, and the deafening roar of artillery around him. 2 hours had passed since Conner had left the command post. German shells landed within yards, American shells exploded near his position, shrapnel cutting through the frozen earth. Yet he stayed in the ditch, repeating fire orders, calculating every impact. The battalion's lives depended entirely on him. The Germans could not advance without suffering catastrophic losses. Conner had become the singular pivot point of this frozen battlefield. A lone lieutenant whose courage would define the survival of hundreds. The German attack continued relentlessly across the frozen fields and forests of the Colmar Pocket. First Lieutenant Garlin Murl Conner, 25 years old, remained in the shallow ditch he had chosen as his observation post. The snow crusted over his boots, his hands numb from the cold, but he kept the telephone handset pressed to his ear. Every second mattered. The German infantry had closed to 100 yards, advancing in skirmish lines, rifles ready, shouting only when necessary. The Tigers were still moving, massive 60-ton tanks creeping through the trees, their turrets scanning for targets, engines grinding through frozen earth. Conner could see the Balkans' markings on the Tiger turrets and the faces of their commanders. Each tank was a fortress, each gun a threat to every American foxhole. Conner called in the first fire mission. 12 American 105mm howitzers 3 miles behind the front line responded. The shells landed behind the German infantry, too far at first, but he adjusted quickly. "Drop 100, fire for effect," he said. The shells exploded in the frozen tree line. Dirt, wood splinters, and shrapnel flew through the air. The Germans hesitated, some taking cover behind trunks, some returning fire blindly. The Tigers advanced through the smoke, but Conner kept counting, calculating, observing every move. Every burst of artillery needed to hit precise points or the infantry would overrun the line. He repeated the salvo, adjusting fire left and right. Each shell landing closer to the advancing Germans increased the pressure. A German officer, probably a 22-year-old lieutenant, crawled ahead of his men through the snow, signaling silently. Conner dropped the next rounds directly on his position. The officer disappeared, 4 soldiers fell, and the rest flattened against the snow. The German advance faltered. The forest had become a killing ground. The American artillery was now a wall of destruction, creating chaos in the enemy ranks. But the Tigers remained. Conner observed their slow wedge formation. 2 tanks in front, 2 in the middle, 2 trailing. The lead Tiger fired its 88mm gun, obliterating a nearby American foxhole 300 yards away. Conner could see the destruction. Soldiers lay dead in the snow, frozen bodies crushed by dirt and splintered wood. He called coordinates closer. The next salvo landed within 10 yards of the lead tank. The track broke. The Tiger swerved and stopped. Smoke poured from the engine deck of another. One Tiger's turret was damaged, rendering it nearly useless. 2 more remained operational, advancing deliberately toward Conner's position. Conner adjusted the fire again. Drop 50. Fire for effect. Each salvo landed in front of, behind, and to the sides of the tanks. He watched the explosions lift snow into the air, the blast waves hammering him in the ditch. The Germans were adjusting, professional soldiers, yet the precision of Conner's observation forced them to stagger their advance. The infantry tried to regroup, using the remaining Tigers as mobile cover, but the Americans' machine guns and rifle fire cut down any soldier attempting to flank the ditch. The artillery was now running low. The fire direction officer reported only 15 minutes of sustained fire remained. Conner and a private from the battalion intelligence section worked together. The private had crawled from the foxholes, dragging extra wire and a backup handset. His leg was bleeding from shrapnel, but he refused to leave. He stayed in the ditch, calling out German positions, counting movement, assisting Conner in directing fire. The last remaining Tiger closed to 50 yards from the American line. Its turret traversed, machine guns opening fire on every visible position. Conner called coordinates directly on top of the tank. High explosive, maximum concentration, 12 guns firing simultaneously. The shell landed 10 yards behind, another 15 to the left, the third directly in front. The lead tank swerved, blinded, stuck in a crater. Its crew abandoned it. 3 others were disabled or forced to retreat. Conner's precise targeting had neutralized the German armor. The infantry, now scattered and pinned, attempted one final push. Conner walked the artillery fire across small groups hiding behind shell craters, across tree lines, across approaches where reinforcements might appear. The remaining Germans were veteran soldiers, experienced in combat, but every move was met with calculated American fire. 150 soldiers lay dead, another 50 scattered and disoriented. Conner and the private continued, adjusting left, right, and center, creating a wall of explosions that made further advance impossible. The German observers had pinpointed Conner's location. Shells began landing closer, 20 yards, 15, 10. The ditch became the focal point of converging artillery fire. Dirt, snow, and fragments exploded around them. Conner adjusted fire to counter the German positions, neutralizing artillery threats 3 miles behind the front line. The Germans could not advance. Without Conner directing the guns, the attack would have succeeded, and the American line would have collapsed. After nearly an hour and 20 minutes in the ditch, Conner finally saw the German infantry breaking apart, some surrendering, others fleeing through the snow. The remaining Tigers were either destroyed, abandoned, or immobilized. His assistant private, though wounded, remained alive. The American line held. The Colmar pocket remained contested, but Conner's actions had saved hundreds of lives that morning. Every movement, every decision, every precise adjustment of artillery fire had turned what seemed like certain death into a fragile victory. Conner had risked everything, Standing alone in the snow, exposed to tanks, artillery, and rifle fire, his bravery became a lifeline for the 3rd Battalion. He had transformed a desperate, hopeless moment into an organized, lethal defense, showing the power of observation, courage, and decisive action on a frozen winter battlefield in January 1945. The sun had barely risen over the frozen Colmar Pocket on January 24, 1945, when First Lieutenant Garlin Murl Conner finally climbed out of the shallow ditch that had been his deadly perch for over an hour and 20 minutes. Snow crunched beneath his boots, his uniform stiff with ice, his hands numb from the relentless cold. Around him, the forest and fields were scarred with craters, shattered trees, and the frozen bodies of German soldiers. The silence that followed the artillery's fury was eerie, broken only by the occasional crack of a distant shell or the muffled groan of a wounded man. Conner's eyes scanned the battlefield. The 6 Mark VI Tiger tanks had been disabled or abandoned. The German infantry had been decimated, scattered across 300 yards of terrain. Hundreds lay dead or dying. Yet 400 determined veterans remained, hunkering down, realizing their armored support had vanished, and they could not continue the assault without it. Conner checked the position of the remaining enemy. American soldiers, exhausted and shaken, peeked cautiously from the foxholes. Some whispered his name, disbelief etched across their faces. The lieutenant, 25 years old, wounded, and recently returned from the hospital, had not just survived. He had changed the course of the battle. The artillery he had directed, his precise calculations and risk, had halted an overwhelming German assault that threatened to overrun the 3rd Battalion's positions. Each call on the handset, each adjustment of fire, had placed him directly in the path of destruction. Every shell that landed danger close had a chance of killing him instantly. Yet Conner had remained focused, watching, calculating, and risking everything for the soldiers he commanded. The private who had assisted him, though wounded in the leg by shrapnel, had survived, his determination mirroring Conner's. Together, they had become the eyes and nerves of the artillery, turning a desperate situation into a controlled counterstrike. The enemy had attempted to regroup, but without tanks or cohesive leadership, they could not advance. Conner walked slowly back toward the command post, wire and handset in hand, his breath steaming in the frigid air. Every step was heavy with fatigue, yet every soldier he passed offered a silent acknowledgement of what had just occurred. The battalion commander, observing from the rear, could hardly believe the transformation on the front line. The German counterattack, which had threatened to break through and overwhelm the American defenses, had been reduced to a failed assault. Conner's courage, tactical awareness, and disregard for personal safety had saved hundreds of lives that morning. The forest, littered with the evidence of artillery and combat, bore witness to a moment where one man's actions had shifted the tide of battle. Conner's name would not appear in every report, yet the memory of his actions would be recounted among the survivors for decades. Later, as temperatures remained 10 degrees below zero, the wounded were evacuated and the artillery crews assessed ammunition and damage. Conner remained vigilant. Every soldier knew the German forces could attempt another push. The Colmar Pocket was far from secure. Yet for now, the 3rd Battalion held. Conner had demonstrated the effectiveness of precise observation, rapid calculation, and daring execution under fire. His ability to direct 12 105mm guns from a shallow, exposed ditch against 6 Tiger tanks and 600 infantry soldiers was a testament to his skill and courage. Conner's actions would not only save lives, but also exemplify the essence of leadership under extreme conditions. The frozen winter of January 1945 in Alsace was brutal, but the story of First Lieutenant Garlin Murl Conner would endure. He had faced artillery, machine guns, and tanks, and yet had maintained composure, directing lethal fire with remarkable precision. The Colmar Pocket, though still contested, remained in Allied hands, and the German forces suffered irreparable losses. Conner's personal bravery and tactical acumen ensured the survival of the 3rd Battalion and the integrity of the American line in one of the last German strongholds in France. As the battalion regrouped, Conner received recognition quietly. 4 Silver Stars, earned in previous campaigns: October 1943 in Italy, January 1944 at Anzio, September 1944 in France, February 1945, were reminders of a pattern. He did not stay behind lines, he led when others could not, and he risked life to save others. On this morning, in the frozen fields and forests near Houssen, France, Conner had repeated that pattern. Each shell fired at the German advance, each precise adjustment, was not just artillery. It was life-saving, strategic, and decisive. The 3rd Battalion could breathe again, regroup, and hold the line. The story of bravery, sacrifice, and the brutal reality of January 1945 would echo through history as a reminder of courage under fire. Conner looked at the battlefield one last time. The destroyed Tigers, the fallen infantry, the cratered snow. All evidence of what a single determined officer could achieve. The Germans had retreated. The battalion survived. And the frozen winter of the Colmar Pocket would remember the name of First Lieutenant Garlin Murl Conner, the man who stood in the snow, commanding artillery fire against impossible odds, turning near-certain defeat into a fragile victory.